But here we are with Death and Rebirth Comics. All right. By Jay Wilburn. He was always destined to die at work. If Dave Fisher realized what had happened to him when he collapsed next to the register at Fisher Books, he might have been okay with it. Before he opened the store in 1948, he had worked in a foundry under one of his former commanding officers. There were all sorts of risks of the death. There were all sorts of risks of death there. And though he was thankful for the job after the war, he certainly hated it too. Of course, his job before that was storming beaches and liberating camps, right up until the day Dave collapsed while clutching his chest. Collapsed in his bookstore. Is bookstore a compound word? Of course it is. I need to be sure to fix that all through this. Dave collapsed in his bookstore while clutching his chest. He remained surprised he survived his long vacation across Europe. All right. Of course, he's talking about the World Wars. Dave lifted his head and still clutched his chest for a moment before he straightened his suit. Dying was always confusing, but Dave had particular trouble figuring out that he had passed. His body was still there, slumped and going cold. He wouldn't be discovered until one more customer entered the bookstore a full hour after normal closing. His wife would be informed, let's say Dave's. All right. Dave's wife would be informed later. Let's say shortly after. Shortly after that, not surprised at all until the officer arrived with the bad news that her husband had stayed late. His kids were grown by that day in 1964. By that, let's say last day. By that last day in 1964, and they wouldn't find out about their dad until the following days. Until the following, let's say day. I don't want to make it look like Dave's wife took a long time to get hold of the kids. Dave Fisher, his spirit anyway, wandered between the shelves for several days and nights. It's getting slow, he kept saying. The passage of time was confusing too. The passage of time was confusing too, but not because it was slow. Dave was missing things, which was very different from how detail-oriented he was in life. All right, good stuff. He only just became, let's fix a typo. That's what editing is for, right? He only just began to realize something bigger was amiss when he spotted the front windows soaped over and the sign turned to close even though it was broad daylight. He wasn't cursing. All right, he wasn't a cursing man, let's say. Not since he left the service and cut back on his drinking. Let me add here, it wasn't a religious thing, although he did believe in God. The war didn't beat that belief out of him, although it almost did. The fact that he wasn't seeing God following his death added to his confusion. Dave had stopped cussing because it made him feel less like himself. Made him feel low in front of his wife and kids. Dave, no, let's just say he decided he'd had enough low days for a dozen lifetimes. Alright, I kind of like that. Little character development for Dave there. But he let a few choice words fly when he saw the condition of his windows. Why would kids do that? The locked door refused to give. He tried to turn the latch from the inside a few times, but his fingers kept slipping off. He managed to get the door to rattle in its frame once, and then a second time. This was over the course of a few hours, but Dave didn't feel the passage of that time. Not the way living people outside the closed bookstore experienced it. Not all ghosts were capable of those little interactions with the physical world. It wasn't much, though. Any passerby would have chalked it up to wind, even though everyone in town knew that Dave had passed away weeks ago inside. He tried once more to force the door. Business was hard enough without having your windows covered and your door locked during the workday. Never mind. Is never mind more than one word? Never mind that it was now almost sundown and the owner was dead. This time the door did not rattle, but his hand as he perceived it slipped through the solid glass. It felt like a blade through the bones and veins of his wrist. It hurt like hell. It shocked him out of his selective blindness as well. None of the physical sensation was real. Though, as his hand, wrist, and the rest of his body, and even the suit he still thought he wore, were now under the dirt 11 miles away. All right. His fingers outside the door grew numb. Pain traveled in both directions. From that dividing piece of glass. The cold outside was so deep as to burn like a freezer. It instantly reminded him of that terrible winter back during the war. Dave drew his hand to his chest and felt raking agony as it passed through the glass again. He rubbed the back of his... I already used the word aching. No, I use raking. Okay, we're just going to rhyme here, I guess. He rubbed the back of his aching knuckles and stepped away from the door as if the thing had stung him. He turned and really looked at his store. The shelves were empty. Canvas sheets that covered some of them had slipped off to puddle upon the unswept floor. A few books remained stacked in spots as if forgotten. Dave approached slowly and examined the torn cover of one. In 1964, he still had mostly hardbacks. That's a first edition. Why would you leave it like this? He scanned the room and spied the discolored square on the counter where the register used to be. He breathed out his wife's name and then each of his sons in the order of their birth. While he did this, he thought about collapsing. And remembered. He thought about and remembered collapsing on the counter. What? Okay. He thought about and remembered collapsing on the counter, what just felt like moments ago to him. But now he darkly realized it had been longer. The pain in his hand, even as it subsided, reminded him of the crushing agony in his chest that had traveled down his arm. He should have gone to the doctor more, like his wife asked. In 1964, heart attacks not one word, is it? No. In 1964, heart attacks came quick and often were not survived. Okay. My father went the same way. He let out another breathy curse. Dave looked over the empty shelves again. He had vague memories of his wife. Let's say, if he concentrated, he had vague memories of his wife, 2 of his sons, and some friends from church unloading the shelves. He had not registered what any of that meant at the time. He still was not seeing clearly then. Not as clearly as he saw now. "I'm dead," he said it out loud. At least it felt out loud to him. He waited, expecting his body to turn to vapor, to either ascend or descend to the next level as his works in life might have dictated. But it appeared that the revelation alone was not enough to move him on. All right, let me add some things here. Where was God? Where were the angels and his relatives? Where were the angels and his relatives? Where was his reward or punishment? This could be the punishment, he told himself. What can be worse than seeing everything you worked for deteriorate over time? When he turned forward, he found the windows boarded over as opposed to soap. Time had slipped it by again. Dave remembered he had grandchildren on the way. What a shame he would never get to hold them. What a shame his wife had to go on alone. She was still relatively young. She'd probably remarry, but he didn't want to think about that. Let's say, how many men had died young right in front of him overseas as he went on. They had just been kids and would never be anything else. Dave supposed he should be grateful for the life he had. But that wasn't so easy when he found himself a ghost losing time in his abandoned bookstore. Alright, I like that. Okay. We'll keep moving along here. How long? Getting no answer. He approached the door. The only signs of daylight were harsh slivers that passed through the edges of the boards. Dave bent down and brought his eye close to one of those gaps. He still recognized most of the businesses outside. The car models had not changed. He decided it might just be months after his death, maybe a year at the outside. It was a little difficult to focus his vision. His view of the world out there sometimes doubled and tripled. It was suddenly dark again, and the streetlights spilled pale glow over the deserted downtown. And the streetlights spilling pale glow over the deserted downtown made him sad. I'm going to put a comma there to help break that up. Dave turned to see in the dim interior that even the shelves had been removed at this point. This was now a deserted, abandoned building. He supposed he knew that his sons had found better work on their own. That was the dream he had for them, wasn't it? All right. Maybe he thought he'd live long enough to pass this place on to his then unborn grandchildren. Dave Fisher. Let's say some men died young on foreign beaches. While others didn't quite make it long enough to hold their grandchildren. All right. Dave Fisher, not moving on from the abandoned building, stood and waited. He wasn't sure what he waited for, though. Dave got better about keeping track of time. It still slipped past him in chunks on occasion, but he was pretty good about catching back up with what he had missed. Of course, it helped that Parker Hardware moved into the space in 1965. Dave liked Tony Parker. He never served, but Dave was sure, had he met Tony in life, that they could have been friends. Tony stayed late to catch up on work as well. Sometimes Tony's wife Alice and his daughter Millie came in to help. Tony welcomed them, but also insisted they go live their lives. That was what he worked for. That was his dream for them. Tony was a good guy, but Dave had a hunch. Dave had a hunch. What am I talking about? Dave had a hunch about what would happen to Packer Hardware once it was Tony's time to move on. One night, Tony sat over his account books in the back under a shallow light. Dave took the liberty of watching over the living man's shoulder. It was hard to focus his non-existent eyes, but Dave did the best he could. He understood keeping the books. He also figured out what was keeping Tony up at night. I know it seems tough, Dave said, knowing at this point he couldn't be heard. But you run a good business. You have loyal customers. You're good to them. You'll weather this storm, old friend. Dave thought he might be overstepping, but it probably didn't matter since no one could hear him anyway. But that night, Tony Packer did turn off the light and go home. Dave assumed the man went home. He could have been going to a bar to drink away his sorrows. Dave hoped not, mostly for Alice and Millie's sake. He spent a long time staring out the front window of the hardware store at businesses that were slowly changing into names he did not recognize. As he watched the town evolve before him, he thought about his own family again. His wife never visited the hardware store. He started to wonder if she might have moved away to start a new life, maybe a new life with somebody else. Okay, I was going to add something, but I don't think I need to there. The new kid was stealing from Tony Packer, and it pissed Dave off to no end. He actually tried to punch the little punk more than once and failed. One time the kid scratched at his neck after one of Dave's haymakers, but that probably meant nothing, though. Then he tried something. "The kid is stealing from you," he whispered in Tony's ear day after day. It was maybe a week later that Dave noticed Mr. Packer watching closer. A few days after that, the kid was caught and dismissed. A couple nights after that, a brick came through the front window and passed right through Dave's form, along with jagged shards of glass. Dave actually tried to chase after the laughing thugs outside, but even with the window gone, he found himself incapable of passing through. Tony could hardly afford to replace it, but he did. They never pinned it on the kid, as far as Dave could tell. All right. There were other setbacks as well, but none as big as the day Tony Packer collapsed in the floor one morning. Several people rushed to his side, including unseen Dave Fisher. Tony was quite old at that point. He'd had bypass surgery, and Millie had watched the store for the few weeks of his recovery. He did not recover from this one, though. Let's say this last one, though. All right. For a number of days, Dave kept expecting Tony Packer to show up as a ghost, too. He had died in the store, after all. Dave was still there. It just stood to reason. But Dave remained alone as the single haunting spirit of this address. Staring out the window and thinking about it brought him little comfort. It was 1982 at this point, and he recognized nothing out there. Alice and Millie worked to keep the store open. Dave was proud. He wondered if Tony could see them and all they did for his legacy from wherever he was. Maybe he was here too, but ghosts just couldn't see each other. Dave had never observed another ghost as far as he knew. He tried his best to speak encouragement to the Packer ladies, but times had changed. There were large chain stores to compete with. Dave was kind of glad he didn't live long enough to have to deal with that himself. They finally had to close the place in 1984. He hardly blamed him, but was sad to see the place go. He had kind of felt a partial ownership of the store after all these years, not to mention that it was lonely once the place was empty again. It was hard to track time like this. He wondered if he'd ever be free. He wondered if his wife was still alive, what his kids were doing, what kind of people his grandkids that he never met turned into. The comic book store opened in the late spring of 1986. All right. When he learned the name of the new store was Fisher Comics, Dave was sure it was one of his sons or grandkids who took the place over. Art Spire was no relation, though, not unless Dave had Jewish heritage he was utterly unaware of. Things had been tough in town for Jewish businesses in Dave's day. That bothered him on a deep level. Dave would have never described himself as a liberal or progressive. Those words had slightly different meanings in his time. But he had fought a war against that sort of nastiness. He had walked through camps where hell had bled out on earth. He suffered nightmares the rest of his life from it, and even in death he remembered still. Seeing that same hatred played out at home during his lifetime, made him feel ashamed. Art seemed to get along fine. He was jovial and remembered customers' names. Dave would have described Art as bookish. Nerdy was the word for it today. At first, Dave thought he might be quite helpful if he could get through to Art. Dave had been a bookstore owner, after all, and it turned out that Art Spire named his store after Dave's original business in the spot. All right, let's say that was something. And Dave Fisher appreciated it. All right, moving right along. Inside was a framed picture, and the outside of the store looked quite similar to Dave's original facade, a real tribute. But Dave Fisher was lost in the world of comics. They had existed in his time, of course, but nothing like this. There were more heroes. Many of them had multiple books. People paid big for the old comics in good shape. What kid ever kept a comic in good shape? Some were sealed in plastic, never to be opened. And the way they depicted female hero characters, it was practically smut. It was practically smut. Okay, there we go. Dave spent years just sort of turning in circles, watching all the color along the shelves blur through his vision as more and more titles flew on and off the walls, let's say. Then Art started selling more toys than comics. After that came card games Dave didn't understand. Art held tournaments in the store at night. Dave tried to pick up on the rules, but eventually gave up. Business dropped off, and before Dave knew it, Fisher Comics closed for good in 1992. Another business with the Fisher name had gone under. As far as he knew, Art Spire had survived at least. That was an accomplishment over the previous two owners. Dave spoke to the dark, empty building. Good for you, Art. Be well, my friend. All right, I like that. A video store, Dave said out loud, from his perspective again. From his perspective, anyway. Again, he was still trying to wrap his head around the concept. Hightower Video opened in 1993. Mr. Hightower was a giant of a man. He sort of reminded Dave of the late Tony Packer. All right. But what the hell was a video store? All right. It appeared that movies could be obtained in boxes and then watched at private houses. Sometimes the kids working the store would play movies over televisions mounted from the ceiling, but Dave still pictured families using theater-style projectors in their living rooms. What a wonder to behold. All right. As this store started to struggle, Dave empathized, but had no concept how to help. The business model made zero sense to him. No matter how long he watched customers come. Watch customers. Let me fix the spelling there. As he watched customers come and go and return again. Be kind. Rewind. Dave read, but he pronounced wind like a blowing wind. It was like a foreign language to him. When Hightower Video finally closed and Billy Hightower moved on to other things, Dave wasn't surprised. He braced himself for another long wait in the midst of all these video shelves, but he had no idea how long it would be. 2016. Dave was at a loss. He could hardly fathom the date. This was deep into the new century. This was science fiction territory. He expected to see flying cars, but even though they looked like spaceships to him, they still rolled along the ground. Maybe he couldn't see the flying ones because they were over the top of the store in the sky. Alright, there we go. He didn't exactly feel cursed, but he did feel lost, to say the least. That was even before he tried to understand the new business. Juice House Vape. What did that even mean? Were they selling the liquid, the pipes? Was it tobacco? Was it just the steam that it appeared to be? Let me put a question mark there. Was this the new century's version of an opium den? All right, let me put a question mark there. Dave had no idea. The guy who ran it was called Chili. Was that a name, a title? The customers almost seemed to be speaking another language. Even the words he knew, he could barely understand with their strange accents. Was English going away? Was this linguistic drift? Would he soon find himself an alien in the place that used to be his bookstore, which is one word here. Alrighty. Something happened in 2020. Chili still ran the place but wore a mask like a doctor. Let me put a period there. Dave assumed it was a fashion statement of the day. Chili kept the place up but was constantly closed that year. Others outside wore those masks as fashion too. Dave started to believe he was seeing ghosts wandering the streets out there, but he couldn't be sure. Chili finally shuttered the place in 2021. Death and Rebirth Comics opened in early 2022. Dave braced himself to be even more lost than before, but the new owner set the place up much like a bookstore. There were still games and toys. There was also a coffee shop. Some people still say lots of people sat and read like it was a library. They bought stuff though. Dave kind of wished. I have a space here. I don't like that. It makes me feel like maybe I lost something there. Alright, Dave kind of wished he had thought about that when he had been alive. Some people still wore the doctor's mask, but that fashion appeared to be going out of style. Josh Fisher. Dave wondered. It wasn't an uncommon name, but he made sure to listen in on Josh's conversations to see excuse me, to see if he could find anything out. One day, Josh's girlfriend was there. She had blue hair and a ring in her nose like a bowl. Dave tried not to judge. Let's say they discussed the building belonging to Josh's great-grandfather. Dave Fisher had no physical heart anymore, but he still felt it skip a beat. It had been a long, well, not long enough that I need an extra zero in there. It had been a long trip around, but finally one of his descendants had made good by the place. Dave hoped this one lasted longer than some of the others. He wasn't sure what he could do to help that, but this was family and he intended to do right by them. He looked toward the window and through at other businesses and cars he no longer recognized. Let's say even the non-flying style of cars. Instead of dwelling on the outside he could never reach, Dave focused on the work Josh Fisher put into making this place inside a fine business again. All right.